there was Cecilia. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is 3 on our clock. I welcome you all to this first in a series of maritime webinars, and it is now starting the webinar. Thank you, Cecilia, from our UNCTAD IT team, who has set up this excellent webinar. I'm your moderator. I'm Jan Hoffmann, head of the Trade Logistics branch. I just run you through some very quick housekeeping. We have a very good panel here. We want to stick to the 60 minutes. Shamika Zirimane, our director of the Division of Technology and Logistics, will welcome you and open the webinar. Thereafter, Helio Vicente from the International Chamber of Shipping will make the main substantive presentation. We really would like this to be a substantive discussion webinar. Then we have 3 discussants. We start with Gabriel Petros from the Chamber of Commerce, based in Paris, followed by the African Union Commission, Eric, connecting with us from Addis Ababa. And last but not least, Hasiba Benamara from UNCTAD. These will be the discussants. So that's the agenda. You have seen it and you have connected because you thought that was interesting. It will be interesting. We will be very open to read and take into account your comments and especially your questions. For this, we have the chat functions. Please use the chat function for this. As a moderator, I will be the one passing on the questions, but I believe the other panelists can also read them while we speak. And last but not least, this meeting is being recorded. So, you know, it is being recorded. Also, if you ask a question, what you write may be recorded. And of course, this is also live streamed through Facebook. Without any further ado, very happy to pass on the floor to my favorite director, Shamika Zirimane, Division of Technology and Logistics.
Thank you, Jan. Good day to all of you who are joining this very first session of the Maritime webinar series. As Jan said, and we are going to start with the presentation on by International Chamber of Shipping on protectionism in maritime economies. But then we will have a series of very interesting topics discussed. We will talk about the shippers' concerns in the middle of July and technology and digitalization. And we take up labor issues and climate change issues, ports, and also trade facilitation. So this is a series that we go through as we also prepare for UNCTAD 15. This is our quadrennial ministerial meeting. It's a mandate giving meeting for us. And I think member states are quite keen on maritime issues. So this is also part of building to that, our own meeting. So we are very happy to do this series in collaboration with our many partners like yourselves on the screen in international organizations and private sector. And I just want to start saying that the maritime transport sector has become an important economic activity for developing countries. So that's why we want this research, brought here and discussed openly. I think, Helio, you said in your report, 60% of maritime transport activities now take place in developing countries. This is the loading and unloading of goods. And 42% of ships are owned by developing countries, 79% of ship registration, 75% of ship building, 99%, basically 100% of ship scrapping, and 65% of container shipping activity, arrivals, they're all happening in developing countries. Of course, high-end value addition is done by high-end developing countries. We are talking about China, Singapore, Republic of Korea, but increasingly more developing countries are, carving a place in maritime transport for themselves. So it's very important for us to take up these issues. So it is in this light, it is very good to have some solid analysis, Helio, done on how to make the sector more efficient by pursuing sector liberalization. I think the study shows significant gains from liberalization in terms of GDP, in terms of trade, and so forth. Now, I want to highlight that these are the gains from moving from one suboptimal equilibrium to an optimal equilibrium with liberalization. So the devil, as you know, is in the details of that transition. How do you transition from one equilibrium to the other equilibrium? In many developing countries, on the way, some sectors, in every country, some sectors and services will gain, some will lose, some jobs will be lost, some jobs will be gained. And most low-income countries, there are no safeguards to protect the fallen. So the things could get quite messy in that transition from one equilibrium to the other equilibrium. And that's where you see the political economy consequences during that transition. So this is our own reality. This is the work that we have done on the ground. This is what we have seen. So it is going from one equilibrium to another equilibrium. There's a lot needs to be done. So I think that's Helio is the second part of your work, of your study. How do we get there? So here I like to highlight a very good practice in liberalization, which is the Trade Facilitation Agreement of WTO. And Jan knows very well. I think Jan has been leading this effort in UNCTAD. UNCTAD has been involved from the crafting of the TFA now to implementation of the TFA on the ground. And there, the liberalization is sequential according to the capacity of developing countries, after taking into consideration very careful needs assessment exercises, and also with funding made available by development partners when you transit from this suboptimal equilibrium to the good equilibrium. So Helio, so thank you so much for being the very first one to go out of the door on this seminar, our series, and presenting this important study on maritime protectionism. I think it's a very good beginning for us to think through how to do this transition to the optimal equilibrium. So thank you very much, Helio. Over to you, Jan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shamika and Helio Vicente from the International Chamber of Shipping. We really have a long-standing partnership with helping each other out in events and statistics, peer reviews of our research, and really it's as we had already in this particular study. Shamika was there when you launched it in London. UNCTAD will also be at a subsequent event where this will be discussed specifically in the WTO context. But we are happy to discuss this with you and provide the space for discussion with a special focus on the developing countries' interest, maritime development. So Helio, you have the floor. We tested the screen sharing before, it did work. So the floor is yours, Helio. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much, Shamika, for the wonderful introduction. I'll proceed to sharing my screen, hopefully without any hiccups, as was the case during the presentation. Can you see that? Is that okay?
Yeah, it works well. Excellent.
Okay. So a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. And as I said, a special thank you to the UNCTAD Secretariat for allowing us to deliver this presentation on the global study on protectionism in maritime economies. The study was formally published earlier this year, as Jan mentioned, on the 24th of February. And through this presentation, I would like to give a general overview of the research, highlighting what we're seeking to achieve, some of our key findings and messages, and our strategic engagement efforts with the likes of UNCTAD and beyond that as well. The overarching narrative of the study is that all countries benefit considerably from maritime transport services. Against this backdrop, the report highlights some of the negative effects that maritime trade restrictions, which raise the cost of doing business to the detriment of national economies, local consumers, and other sectors that rely heavily on these services could suffer. So we hope that the study can serve as a helpful tool to assist any maritime nation in identifying the wide range of restrictive measures that's preventing them and their national economies from reaping the full benefits of more efficient maritime transport services. But I think Shamika made a very good point in their introduction, that actually there's scope to look beyond this. How do you look at getting the right balance between the benefits that some countries might gain in one sector and then lose in another? And I think that there's a lot of potential scope for further exploration there, and we look forward to looking into that. To help nations identify these restrictive measures, the study doesn't just focus exclusively on traditional tariff barriers. We also assess non-tariff restrictions by translating them into tariff equivalents. And in this exercise, we were able to ascertain that non-tariff barriers are in fact 4 times higher than traditional tariffs would suggest. For most countries, non-tariff measures are typically 3 to 5 times more restrictive than traditional tariffs. I think the only exception in that graph is Nigeria, that you can see sort of towards the bottom of the graph. The study demonstrates that no matter what their level of economic development, all national economies would benefit from liberalization of maritime trade regimes. These gains can be maximized if reforms are undertaken through a combination of across-the-board domestic reforms and multilateral reforms as well. As mentioned in the previous slide, the data surrounding the 4 ICS reform scenarios reveals that policy reform can offer notable gains in both trade and GDP terms. The world map that we're showing in this slide highlights the potential for real GDP increase under the study's most ambitious reform scenario 1, whereby all countries reduce the levels of restrictiveness by 50%. We do concede that a 50% reduction is quite an ambitious scenario, but it is an ambitious scenario. But hopefully this provides a good guidepost for what can be achieved, depending on a country's level of ambition, of course, which can be adjusted as necessary and in accordance with those countries' priorities. The 4 scenario, as mentioned, are laid out in this graph. We've been through scenario 1. Scenario 2 is essentially the same scenario, but it's probably a more realistic scenario where we're looking at a reduction of 10% as opposed to a 50% reduction. Then under scenario 3, we have the modest and unequal scenario, if you like, where high income economies would cut their levels of restrictiveness by 10% and all other countries would cut it by 5%. But although we analyze this in the study, we do, and there are gains to be made under this scenario. In fact, I think from a developing country perspective, you do end up leaving a lot of the gains on the table. So although you do see gains, they are marginal, and you do end up leaving the vast majority of the gains that you could otherwise make from, let's say, a scenario 2 on the table. Then the scenario 4, all countries would focus on traditional tariff restrictions through improvements based on changes made to countries' commitments and trade agreements. So we looked at the different agreements that different countries had in place, and the more agreement, and took the view that the more agreements that you have in place, the better connected you are with other economies, and you viewed better under that particular scenario. I should point out with the previous slide that the study is not prescriptive in the way that countries liberalize their sectors. That very much depends on the laws that they have in place and so on and so forth. What the study does do is it can serve as a springboard for an assessment by governments of those different restrictive measures that they have in place. We based the majority of the research on the WTO ITIP database, which highlights all those different restrictive measures in place. So what does these benefits mean in the context of developing countries? If we look at, for example, South Africa under the highly ambitious scenario, so if we take a look at their GDP gains, we can see that they would stand to gain under the highly ambitious, where all countries reduce levels of restrictiveness by 50%, they would stand to gain nearly 1% in terms of their GDP gains under scenario 1. We could look at Kenya under the modest and unequal scenario. So the gains will understandably be smaller in this particular one, with Kenya under scenario 3 is just 0.12%. So these are some of the benefits that developing countries and developed countries, I should say, would see if reforms were implemented. While the report found that high-income economies would experience an average increase of 4.5%, which you can see in the table in relation to goods exports, if they were to loosen tariff restrictions and non-tariff restrictions in a modest and equal way, developing economies would experience an even greater average increase of about 7% if they were to reduce their restrictions in a similar way, i.e. Modest and equal. To incentivize countries to implement suitable reforms, a major feature of the study is the index on protectionism in maritime economies, which you can see there. So it's essentially a global ranking whereby each country is given a particular score, which is dependent on their level of restrictiveness. The scores were calculated based on 5 overarching criteria, which you can see in this slide. Each of these is further subdivided into 14 sub-criteria that encompass some 77 elements corresponding to various restrictive measures. Under sub-criteria 11 on commitments in WTO agreements, I believe it was Shamika who mentioned the WTO trade facilitation agreement, and I'm sure Gabrielle will also be pleased to note that we do take the status of ratification of the WTO trade facilitation agreement into account in our criteria. I'm very aware of the great deal of work that UNCTAD is doing in the context of the TFA and the ICC as well in the context of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. The data in this graph summarizes the overall prime index in the context of the overarching criteria we saw in the previous table in terms of their relative weight for each of four world regions, namely Africa and the Middle East, Asia and Pacific, Latin America, as well as Europe and the Atlantic. A few patterns emerge from this. For example, tariffs and agreements weigh much more heavily than management and employment in all regions and most countries. Restrictions on operation and competition are the most burdensome measures in the Asia and Pacific and the Europe and Atlantic regions, but come in third place in the other 2 regions, albeit Africa and the Middle East, as well as Latin America. Measures of government efficiency and integrity come in second place in Africa and Latin America, but are significantly less prominent in Europe and the Atlantic region. In this slide, we highlight some of the most common restrictions on maritime trade. As you can see from the data on the table, some of these restrictive policies are employed by a significant number of the 46 nations included in the global report. For example, 39 countries impose limits on scope of maritime services that can be supplied through cross-border trade. A further 21 nations impose an obligation to use local maritime transport services, and so on. The study also includes some detailed country profiles covering all national economies analyzed in the report and breaking down their prime scores and providing an assessment of their national maritime trade policies. All profiles can be accessed in their entirety through the full study, and summaries of the profiles are available on the ICS website. The UK, having now left the EU, has its own individual profile, and the EU itself has a single profile, although the European countries in the ranking itself are ranked separately. In terms of the key messages, I think the 4 messages on this slide are fairly self-explanatory. All countries gain from reduction of maritime protectionism, regardless of economic development. I know that sounds very simplistic, and Shamika made some good points in her introductory remarks, and certainly that has been a little bit of food for thought for me already in terms of what we can do going beyond this study. But it's also crucial to give equal focus on the removal of tariff and non-tariff restrictions in both domestic reforms and multilateral negotiations. With respect to policy improvements, a combination of domestic reforms and multilateral negotiations is vital. And last but not least, the nations assessed in our report with lower levels of protectionism also tend to have much more competitive economies, achieve a higher income per capita, and have lower levels of corruption. Therefore, I think it can be inferred that reducing trade barriers in tandem with improvements of national laws and governance should lead to higher income and competitiveness. So it's about how do we get there? We know the message, how do we get there? And that's step 2. If you are interested in accessing the full study, free copies can be made available to UNCTAD member states if you reach out to our publications team, although Jan and his team also do have copies. Jan, please feel free to share with your members as necessary. Strategic engagement goals set by ICS. First, to inform governments about our findings. Highlight the benefits of maritime transport liberalization in a post-COVID context. I think COVID has given us an opportunity to really think outside the box. How can we do things differently? How can we maximize and leverage some of the opportunities that did arise from the pandemic, despite obviously there being some considerable health, social, and economic side effects to it. And last but not least, it's what we're doing today, facilitating discussions between the industry and international organizations such as UNCTAD and regional blocs, including the European Union, African Union, and so on. At global level, in addition to this engagement with UNCTAD, we presented the study at the International Maritime Organization last week, and we will be presenting the study at a high level event on the 29th of June. Jan, we very much look forward to having you in that event, and I see some of our co-organizer colleagues from the WTO are in this meeting, so we look forward to that, and we hope that you can all join us for that event as well, where our Secretary General will be highlighting some of our findings in the context of the WTO. On the back of these global engagements, on the second half of the year, we intend to focus on discussions at regional level. We're already liaising with regional industry partners, and some of whom are represented here. I see some of my industry colleagues in Asia are here. So thank you very much to my colleagues from ASA, and we're looking to put events together in the context of ASEAN, for example, as well as the African Union. So it's very encouraging that Eric is here representing the African Union, and we hope to get in touch alongside the African Ship Owners Associations for discussions that we can have at a regional level. But I think staying with Africa for a little bit, I think just looking beyond the study is a vital starting point, but looking beyond the study, at ICS, we're trying to reach out to Africa and all these different regions that are strategically important to the industry, and we look to building strengthening our relationship with the African Union and other regions as well. One of the main non-governmental international organizations we're currently engaging with is the B20, which interfaces with the G20, and we'll be holding a B20 G20 event in the context of wider trade and investment, where we hope to discuss this study as well. In terms of the role of UNCTAD has always had the interest of developing countries as a core principle, and that was highlighted quite clearly by Shamika's presentation, introduction. So we believe that cooperation with UNCTAD and individual nations is vital to achieve the aims of the report. And that is the presentation from my side. Apologies that it went a little bit longer than I would have wanted it to, but hopefully it was worth the while. Thank you.
It was certainly all worth the while. Thank you very much, Helio. And as you concluded, also the role or the participation of developing countries. To some extent, what you described was the chicken and egg question. Very, very simplified, you said that by reducing barriers, developing countries would actually, on average, with different regional differences, gain more than countries who are already more developed. And at the same time, these reforms and improvements are also more difficult for developing countries. And we have seen similar situations in other negotiations, especially the trade station, very much the similar studies, similar type of studies. And we have worked actually with the same consultants to some extent that you used for this study. And it's always the same story that, yes, there will be more benefit, but it's also more difficult. So that is then where organizations like UNCTAD come into play. Our goal is to help developing countries to actually achieve this and not to be overrun or just be passive, but actually participate. And Shamika gave some numbers at the beginning. The share of developing countries in different maritime sectors has been growing, and this has been good for their development, but it's not always as easy as summarized in a 15 minutes PowerPoint. So thank you, Helio. So we start with our first discussant, the business perspective, again, international, Gabriel from the International Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone. Very good to see you, Dr. Shamika. Very good to meet you, Eric, from the African Union. Elio, thanks a lot for the great presentation. And, of course, thanks for the invitation. I think, first of all, the ICC, we are the institutional voice of 45 million business across the planet. Before working for the headquarters here in Paris, I used to be executive director for ICC in Brazil. So we work very closely with the developing countries. We do represent developing countries as well, although our headquarters are here in France. So it's a real pleasure to join you. And first of all, I'd like to congratulate the International Chamber of Shipping for this great study. I think it sets a lot of what we can do together in the future, both the private sector and governments, on pushing for reforms. And I totally agree with the points that Dr. Shamika and Ian brought, in the sense that we should look for compromises and how we can consider the different realities on the ground, and how we can actually help developing nations to compensate potential losses with because reforms, we know that it's about actually compromising with the different interests on the ground. I think we should be very transparent on identifying which are those interests and how we can actually help to mitigate any effects on the short term. But having said that, I'd like also to highlight the importance of the shipping industry for business. I think this year with COVID, the industry as a whole, it was a great stress test for the shipping industry worldwide. And it proved actually the importance of the shipping industry, especially for actors that were not looking at that. And I think everyone, at least once, perhaps in this pandemic, we actually bought online. We went to e-commerce, and we know that for e-commerce to work well, behind that, there's the whole logistics and the transportation industry and the technology industry. So it's actually, I think the positive side of that crisis actually actually incentivizes us to look for other actors that are kind of low profile, but they're very important and key, such as the shipping industry. And I think the study that Elio brought today proves that it's actually a low-hanging fruit for us in terms of potential benefits for the world economy. If we do push those reforms around for all, I think it's a win-win, as we can clearly see in the charts presented by Elio. Another point that I'd like to highlight from this great study is the perception about the importance of international trade and trade liberalization in different countries. So there's a ranking that ICS brought in the study, which is really interesting. And I think we should start looking on how to work with the different stakeholders on that. For example, SMEs. There are still, perhaps the relationship between SMEs, the SMEs world, and the shipping industry is kind of distant, is still distant. So maybe we could, that's I think a point to explore, because SMEs are the backbone of global economy. They do represent 80% of global business. At the same time, the perception when we discuss about the shipping industry, I think for the general public, it's about corporates, big companies, big exporters, traders. But we should have in mind that the shipping industry is also important for SMEs. So that's a question I'd like to bring to this debate. How can we actually work with SMEs to explain them and bring them on board on the importance of trade liberalization, especially on logistics? Because we know that they can actually be ultimately benefited with those reforms. I think looking ahead, as ICC, we are definitely interested in working with ICS and UNCTAD to bring the business support to those reforms. Again, especially in developing countries where we need to look very carefully on how to implement those reforms and actually work to mitigate any short-term effects that might prevent those reforms from moving forward. Thanks a lot, Jan, for the invitation, and I look forward for the questions and in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as you mentioned, questions, I just got a WhatsApp message from a friend. Thank you so much. That apparently the chat function is not active for participants, which may be the reason why nobody has yet asked any questions. And I thought they believed everything we told them, but actually our dear colleague Cecilia may try and find a way so that that the participants can intervene. That was the idea through chat. And in terms of the importance of shipping, actually, thanks for the reminder, Gabriel, because I had on my notes, we definitely want to highlight also the important role of the seafarers who are really paying the price for what you said. Shipping keeps working. Okay, freight rates have gone up. That would be a separate discussion, but there are some difficulties, but overall shipping has served us well during this pandemic. And the ones who are really paying the price are seafarers who are stuck on the ships because the crewing changes is made so difficult. So thank you, Gabriel, for this reminder. And now a pleasure to pass on the word to our dear colleagues from the African Union Commission. Eric, you had mentioned you work on multimodal and a wide range of transport, and I'm sure you will confirm how important shipping is for this business. You have the floor, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Thank you very much, Helio, for the excellent presentation. Thank you, Gabriel, for your very good insights. First of all, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm the Senior Policy Officer, Air Transport at the African Union Commission. My colleague, Raisa, who is in charge of maritime transport, is currently on leave. And our division is Transport and Mobility, which has maritime transport as one of the key sectors under transport. And then we have air transport, and we have also railway and roads. So as I was saying, maritime transport, we are looking especially probably next year to launch a continental multimodal transport system where we are trying to see what we are doing in the air and road and how we can really link and try to improve, because they are all contributing to logistics. We are trying to see, because a lot have been done in the road and the air transport, but a little has been done in the maritime because of some challenges. To start with, I wanted to say that the maritime transport and ports are backbone of international trade. This is a reality for Africa. The shipping and ports have always played a leading role in the development of trade in Africa. We have 30,725 kilometers of coastline with 1.3 billion of people. We have 90 main ports and 38 island countries. Africa has never been so connected with the rest of the world. So despite all those main ports and a lot of kilometers of coastline, but the connection is still, there are a lot of challenges that I'm going to talk briefly. Over the last decade, shipping and ports in Africa have experienced exceptional growth rate stimulated by trade relations with China. 95% of international trade is by sea, consisting mainly of raw and manufactured products. So this here comes the question of the CFTA. You can see immediately that maritime transport, actually the percentage of the trade for Africa is mainly dominated by sea and by shipping. 40% of merchandise exported by sea was crude petroleum, about 20% of petroleum products and gas. Nevertheless, Africa accounts for less than 2.7% of global maritime trade. 2% of the world containerized traffic And in addition, the continent generated only 1.78% of global container traffic. So you understand these statistics are not very good. That is why we need this collaboration and also to develop some new policy documents to really try to change this. For more than a decade, maritime and port industry has been confronted by substantive structural and technological changes. Both reforms and trade facilitation in the continent have largely been influenced by mergers and acquisitions, modernization of terminals, increase in vessel capacities, and improvement of efficiency and performance. In addition, foreign direct investment in Africa in the maritime sector increased by 16% from 2013, and between 2007 and 2014, more than $50 billion were invested in the sector in order to accelerate the visibility of African ports. However, no African port was on a list of the world top 100 ports in 2018. The volume transported would be multiplied over the same period by 6 or even 8 to reach 14 million tons in certain land-linked countries without maritime outlets. Geographical location has implication on the cost of intra-African trade. Moving on, I wanted to also talk of some of the issues that has been discussed at the African Union level. The issue of maritime transport has been the subject of debate with the member states of the African Union, and it is still gaining momentum in view of implementation of the Agenda 2063. So under the Agenda 2063, maybe if I can just briefly say, yes, CFTA is one of the key programs. We have the single African air transport market on the side of air transport. We also have a free movement of goods, persons, and services, which is also a very important protocol. And we have also the initiative of having the common passport for Africa. Those are the key programs which I think are relevant to the sector. In the context, the heads of states have adopted the revised 2010 African Maritime Transport Charter, an African policy guidance on maritime transport that seeks to strengthen the role of the sector and ports in the development of the continent. In 2018, there are only 3 African ports in the ranking of world ports, and only one of them ranks among the top 50 ports. Tangier Med, that is one, occupied the 47th rank. Port Said in 57th rank, and Durban, the 62 rank. Alexandria narrowly falls short of making the top 100 list with around 1.6 million TEUs. Together, the 4 most successful African ports handled around 11 million TEUs. Moving on, I just wanted to talk on the CFTA. In accordance with the Abuja Treaty, the Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to integrate African markets, was signed by 54 African countries in March 2018 during the Kigali Summit. The goal is to establish an integrated market of more than 1.2 billion people for goods and services. After many years of negotiations, I must say that the negotiations have not ended. It's not an easy task, as Jan was saying. The African Continental Free Trade Area entered into force at the beginning of 2018, but it started its operations on 1st of January 2021. 54 of the 55 African Union member states have signed the agreement and creates the world's largest trade bloc. The entry into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area is a strong multilateral political signal that must gradually lift barriers that make intra-African trade the least developed on the planet. So when we talk of the issue of liberalization and barriers to trade, for us, we are already looking at it in the context of the CFTA, because maritime transport being one of the key trade in services, it's one of the key trading services under the CFTA. So when you look, we approach this issue of liberalization, issues of cabotage, because this is the main issue for Africa. So we are trying to see in the context of the CFTA. The CFTA, the Economic Commission for Africa, has the potential to increase, according to this, the ECA, the continental free trade area had the potential to increase in traffic and trade by 52.3% by eliminating import tariffs and doubling this trade of non-tariff barriers, and also lowering traditional non-tariff barriers. The agreement aims to simplify trade in goods and services by drastically reducing tariffs and red tape that currently has caused the flow of people and goods on the continent. It should encourage signatory states to undertake reforms necessary to facilitate in-traffic and trade. The single market could generate $450 billion, including $300 billion from the opportunities of cross-border trade and from administrative by reducing corruption and informal practices. In-traffic and exports could thus increase by 81% by 2035 if regulatory reforms and simplification of standards become effective. I guess among the liberalization, these are also the issues which have to be considered. In-traffic and trade represent only 15% of continent total trade against 70% of the European Union. There is no doubt that the effective implementation of CFTA should provide a solution to this problem. Last but not least, COVID-19 pandemic has forced 55 member states of the AU to delay the start of the continental free trade area. Nevertheless, the principle remains established. African ports can therefore become the key, turning point of intra-African trade. So sorry for being late. This is the key highlights I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I think if one were to summarize, paraphrase, a lot of the conclusions of Helio study, the study of the International Chamber of Shipping, presented by Helio, they apply equally on a regional level. And at the African Union, with the African Continental Free Trade Area, you actually have an opportunity to advance some of these by making it easier for a Nigerian ship owner to set up a terminal in Cameroon, which may be part of the trade liberalization and trade and service liberalization, or somebody from Kenya set up a dry port in your country, in Rwanda. Several of these things should be made easier. It's really an opportunity for the African Continental Free Trade Area to benefit from some of the recommendations of the study. That may be one way to put it forward. Without any further ado, last but not least, we continue with UNCTAD, with my dear colleague Hasiba Benamada, lead author of the main chapter 1 of the Review of Maritime Transport, the demand and seaborne trade. Hasiba had a little technical issue with the internet, but I think we can at least hear you, Hasiba, and we saw you at the beginning. So you have the floor. Thank you for joining us, Hasiba.
Yes. Thank you, Jan, and apologies to everyone.
And sorry, Hasiba, sorry, one important thing. We had this issue with the chat function. I was told the chat function is now back to work. So if you have questions, comments from the audience, I saw that Ora Peleng Muzigi raised his hand, but I'm afraid I cannot give the floor or share screen or microphone, but the chat function should now work. So if you want to send comment suggestions, please do so in the chat function. And now, yes, Hasiba, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, and apologies to everyone for not being visible. First, I'd like to congratulate really ICS for the study. I believe this is really the first of its kind. I don't think I have seen any similar study that looked really at the liberalization of maritime transport services and looking at the impact on GDP and trade and for many countries. So this is really something really I wanted to highlight, and also really the interesting findings and takeaway messages that have been put forward. It has also, in a way, set out a research and technical assistance agenda for all of us. And that's to see how best countries can, in particular developing countries, can be helped to make maritime transport sector work for their trade, for the economic growth and development. So I think this is was highlighted by Shamika at the beginning and reiterated again, is really, this is the start. And I think there is more work that we need to do in order to dig deeper and see how to reach basically this goal. I was asked by Mr. Moderator to focus on the question, could or should negotiations on maritime transport at the WTO also be of interest for developing countries? Yes, of course. These negotiations are of interest to all countries, including developing countries, so there is no doubt about that. As we all know, and as reported in our annual review of maritime transport and mentioned earlier, many developing countries already participate in the supply and the provision of various maritime transport services. And just like they contribute different shares and participate in different degrees in world maritime trade, port activity and traffic, global value chains, developing countries also contribute at different degrees in the export of transport services, including sea transport services. Just to give you some statistics, today, major exporters of maritime transport services are in Europe, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and North America. And for 2019, and this is based on UNCTAD data, developing countries and transition economies accounted for 45% of the export value of sea transport services. Asia accounted for 96% of this total. And this is really reflected in the predominance of Asia in maritime trade when you look at the statistic for port traffic and maritime trade. And within Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia are definitely the major players. So there's a concentration there in terms of who's exporting these services. In comparison, Africa accounted for less than 2%, Latin America and the Caribbean for less than 4%, the Middle East or Western Asia in the UL language, less than 3%. So clearly, these regions of developing regions, other than East Asia, Southeast Asia, have some catching up to make in this respect. And that's where it gets interesting when we talk about liberalizing maritime transport services sector to have greater participation of developing countries. And with these numbers in mind, and bearing in mind the interdependence of economies and the role of maritime transport in keeping these economies connected, and we've seen that with COVID-19, we were reminded of the importance of this sector in keeping trade flowing. The efforts mentioned in the report to cut on the regulatory measures or commercial practices that distort competition, of course, are very important. And this is maybe a timely opportunity to revisit these issues and probably, resume negotiations at the WTO or bilaterally or regionally. There are, of course, many ways where reform and greater opening of maritime transport services can be pursued, and this was also recognized and mentioned. Negotiated commitments through agreements is one of them, but countries could also implement their own reforms through autonomous liberalization, and this has been happening anyways for many years. And an example where we have seen this is the port privatization or participation of the private sector in port operations. That's an example where there has been liberalization which did not necessarily go through trade liberalization agreements. Autonomous liberalization, unilateral reforms can be a complement in a way to the negotiated commitments. They allow for this reform and measures to be put in place outside the framework of an agreement, and they can therefore provide some of the space or lead time that may be required to test some of the measures, to better understand their effects and adjust to them and their costs, and generally develop and build the capacity to trade. So that it's like a transition period before you reach to the point where you go into an agreement. This is not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other, but basically saying this can go hand in hand. This is all to say that while the gains from multilateral liberalization may be achieve higher level of ambition, countries individually should not refrain from initiating their own reforms. This would be a starting point, basically, for a broader agenda in terms of trade liberalization. the key for governments and national administrations, of course, is to balance the need to protect national interests on the one hand and benefit from more facilitated maritime transport services sector, which in turn facilitates maritime trade flows and potentially increases GDP as simulated in the ICS study. And here I would like to give an example, which is very well known in maritime transport, which are the cabotage laws or regimes. These are recognized as being important to many countries. In this case, when considering market liberalization and reforms, countries may wish to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the local context, the effectiveness of these regimes and laws in achieving the intended objectives such as employment, promoting national fleet development, generating business opportunities, and so on. So there could be a gradual approach to relaxing cabotage laws as a way of benefiting from this liberalization. And I'd like to give just an example here is the CETA agreement between Canada and the EU, where there has been some relaxation since 2017 in the feedering services and involving the Port of Montreal and Halifax, for example. So it's not a full-fledged liberalization or removal of the Coasting Trade Act, but there has been some, at least on the bilateral level of these restrictions. Now, commitments related to access to maritime transport services are also as important as commitments on providing the service. So we have to look at both angles, the service provider, the ability to provide maritime transport services, and the ability to enjoy the maritime service on non-discriminatory basis. So this is also an important element to keep in mind, especially, for example, in ports. And here I would like to mention the GATS, the commitments in the schedule of commitments under the GATS, where we see that the commitments inscribed do not really reflect the reality. I mean, there are countries, and this was also mentioned in the report, where the market is more liberal and open than actually indicated in the commitments. So maybe the first step in terms of negotiations at the WTO would be to commit or to bind the existing level of opening or liberalization to give more certainty about the operating framework, and and to ensure that countries do not go back on their level of openness in terms of operating practice. So that's something just I wanted to note as well. For developing countries, to positively contribute to negotiations and to capitalize on related business opportunities that may emerge, effective market access request offer process is very important. That is to have both defensive and offensive interests clearly defined. And I think, Jan, you mentioned this at the beginning, where don't be passive in a way, and should also, take the opportunity to engage into this liberalization for mutual benefits. I know, Jan, you're probably looking at your watch. Am I over the time or? Okay, okay.
We
just
still
to
need to give some time to Helio to respond to the various
comments. Yes. Just to finish on this, in terms I mentioned earlier, that the study has highlighted the areas where more research may be needed. And this, I will just note two areas, that is studies or case studies to showcase instances where maritime transport services trade liberalization or reduction of restrictions have succeeded, or at least have shown some correlation in reducing transport costs, attracting more users and larger volumes of trade, increasing efficiency, connectivity, because these would make the benefits more tangible and the message hit close to home. Another type or area of research would be to assess or showcase how countries could potentially be affected depending on their comparative advantages, existing enabling framework or structure, supply side constraint and capabilities. This is also to better understand how they position themselves and how they could benefit from the liberalization of taking commitments under international agreements such as the WTO. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hasiba, and for For the participants and colleagues, Hasiba used to be a negotiator herself of GATT, so she knows what she is talking about. So Helio, your study was actually mostly about trade in goods, and the more efficient and reformed and liberalized trade in goods globally becomes, more cargo you have for your constituents, for your members, the shipping companies. And what we have a bit deviated from the topic, we also discussed the same issue of reforming, liberalizing actually the trade and transport services. And you and I know that some of your members may not want to liberalize cabotage, for example. So very provocative. Are you preaching one thing in your study and not always the same thing when it comes to liberalizing trade and shipping services? And we would like to conclude this as promised to everybody after a total of 60 minutes. So you will have the last word, dear Elio. You have 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jan. So much to respond within those 5 minutes, but I'll do my best to stay within that time. Okay, to your question, Jan, I think cabotage has always been a pretty prickly subject, for lack of a better word, and I think it's not so much the interest of my membership per se, but national interests, and how do you balance the national interests against the interests of the collective. So in terms of cabotage restrictions, we know that at the WTO that can be a fairly sensitive subject. So we opted to the best extent possible to focus on what can be done at the international level without getting into the nitty-gritty of that. And there's a very good explanation for that. I think, Jan, it was you in a completely separate discussion we were having a month or two ago, where you said, well, it's been around 10 years or over 10 years since maritime transport negotiations were held in the context of the WTO. So we're not trying to come in and burst the door open and make a whole lot of noise. And when we know that this is a really sensitive sector. So what we're trying to achieve here is just to say, look, maritime transport is here. We're evolving like many other sectors, and we want to have a discussion. I think Hasiba made some insightful comments about the WTO process, much of which was quite, although I understand the theory of it, she clearly has lived it in her previous life, and so I appreciated that. But one of the key takeaways that I got from Hasiba's comments, which is aligned to what we say in the report, is that regardless of what happens at the collective level, multilateral level, such as at the WTO, for example, there are still GDP gains and trade gains to be made by countries individually. So you don't need to hold yourself hostage to the reforms or lack of reforms by your next door neighbor or your regional partners and so on. There are things that you can do by yourself and you will still get GDP gains. And we highlight that in the report with empirical data. From Gabrielle, I think the main takeaway I got from your comments, Gabrielle, was probably cooperation. And I really see, and I think that ties really well with Shamika's introduction and in part some of Hasiba's comment in terms of, okay, the studies there, Hasiba said, it's the first of its kind, and as far as we're aware, it is. So how can we actually put this into practice? We've created the conversation. We're going to take it to the WTO for that multilateral angle, but in terms of potential cooperation, is there a scope for an UNCTAD, ICS, ICC cooperation in that respect for something that is actually meaningful and that we can use to cooperate with individual countries? I think that would be a brilliant idea, and hopefully we can explore that. From Eric, a lot of insightful information. Eric, I'm from Angola originally, which, as you know, is in Southern Africa, so I've got a vested interest in that continent and the region. So I was very encouraged by your insightful comments. And I think what we have in Africa is clearly a willingness. You've got the African Free Trade Agreement and coming into effect soon, the 2060 agenda and so on. So there's a lot of willingness, and it's about how do we put that goodwill, if you like, and put it into practice in a way that, again, going back to what Hasiba had mentioned, that still balances the economic interests of different countries to make sure that really it's not just developed nations that are benefiting from liberalization, but developing countries as well in a balanced way. Hopefully that covers all of the points that were made, Jan.
Good. A good and interesting webinar, seminar event has to stop when it is most interesting. And we promised each other that we will stick to our 60 minutes. I really want to thank all of you very, very much. I think we had a great introduction and presentation of a really important study by the ICS. Then we had the business perspective, we had the regional African perspective, we had the Geneva experience perspective. And this is part of a process. I mean, I think it was very clear on the country level, on the regional level, multilateral level, this process of liberalizing and modernizing trade in goods, trade in services, with at the same time ensuring that developing countries can benefit on it and receive necessary support if necessary. I think that was a key takeaway, I would say, from this. And it's part of a process. On 29 June, there will be a different event, more in the WTO specific context. And on 13 July, I would like everybody to take note. We will have our next UNCTAD Maritime webinar with the shippers, Global Shippers Alliance perspective on different topics. That's for your agenda. Key takeaways for us organizing this: we have to learn how to manage the chat function. That's number one. And the moderator has to learn to somehow stick better to the time, or I don't know. We didn't quite have as much discussion interaction as I had hoped, but I think everything that was said and contributed was very, very relevant. Helio had a good final time still to respond to all these topics. Thank you all. Thank you, participants. Thank you, panelists. And I hope to see you again for our next one on 13 July. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.